Seraphine stood on the landing platform and watched the human colony burn in the distance, under alien fire and smoke that rose like dark. Fingers clawing at the orange sky, and beside her massive form coiled in watchful silence, was HFY her bonded dragon whose scales gleamed like polished obsidian in the fading light, and the beast rumbled deep in its chest, sensing something the elf could not. Yet name the elven warrior had lived for 3,000 years and had seen empires rise and fall across 100 star systems, and she had fought in wars that reshaped galaxies and watched civilizations crumble to dust, and yet standing here on this unremarkable human world called Meridian's Edge, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her ancient heart, and it might have been doubt. The Galactic Council had sent her here to observe and to record, and to bear witness to what they all knew would happen soon, and the humans would fall like all the others had fallen before the endless hunger of the Void Swarm, and that parasitic collective had consumed 27 worlds in the past cycle alone, and no species had lasted more than a week against their relentless advance, and the Council expected humanity to break within days. And then Seraphine would file her report, and the galaxy would forget another primitive species. She descended the ramp with HFY, following close behind, and his massive claws clicked against the metal surface, and human soldiers paused in their work to stare at them both, and some looked afraid and others looked curious, and a few even smiled as if meeting an ancient elf in her dragon companion was just another day in their short, strange lives. A woman approached, wearing the worn uniform of a human military officer, and her hair was gray and her face was lined with years of command, and she extended her hand in that peculiar human gesture of greeting and spoke with a voice that carried authority despite its warmth. Commander Lisa Grant welcomed Seraphine to Firebase Crimson and explained that they were honored to host an observer from the Twilight Dominion, and that she hoped the elf would find their preparations adequate. And Seraphine took the offered hand and felt the calluses there and the strength in that grip, and she wondered briefly if this woman knew she was here to document their extinction. Firebase sprawled across a rocky plateau, and defensive walls ringed the perimeter, and weapon emplacements pointed toward the darkening sky, where soon the enemy would come in force, and soldiers moved with purpose between buildings, and some cleaned weapons and others reinforced barriers, and a few sat in groups, sharing meals and laughing at jokes. Seraphine could not hear. This was what disturbed her most, and not the fear she expected, not the panic that should grip any species facing annihilation, and instead these humans acted as if death was merely an inconvenience, and as if the approaching doom was something to be managed rather than feared, and HFY sensed it too, and the dragon shifted restlessly beside her, and his tail swept across the ground. Lisa Grant led them to an observation tower that overlooked the entire base and explained that Seraphine would have full access to all areas and all communications and all tactical data, and that she was free to go anywhere and see anything because humanity had nothing to hide from those who came to watch them die. And the commander said this without bitterness and without accusation, and simply as statement of fact. Night fell quickly on Meridian's Edge, and the sky turned deep purple, and then blackened stars emerged like scattered diamonds, and somewhere beyond those stars the Void Swarm gathered its forces and prepared to descend, and Seraphine settled into the observation tower and activated her recording equipment and prepared to document what she assumed would be humanity's final. HFY coiled on the tower's wide platform, and his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon, and the dragon had fought beside Seraphine for 8 centuries and had never shown uncertainty before. And yet now he seemed uneasy and restless, and the elf wondered what ancient instincts stirred in her companion's mind below them. The firebase continued its rhythms, and soldiers changed shifts, and patrols walked the walls, and in the mess hall someone played music on an instrument. Seraphine did not recognize, and the sound drifted up through the cool night air, and it was strangely beautiful and strangely sad. She watched a young soldier, no more than 20 cycles by human reckoning, and the woman sat on a barrier, cleaning her weapon with methodical care, and her name tag read. Torres, and her hands moved with practiced efficiency, and when she finished, she did not seek shelter, did not try to rest, and instead, she simply sat and watched the stars and waited. The first alarm sounded at midnight, and Seraphine jerked alert. As klaxons wailed across the base and red lights bathed everything in crimson, and soldiers moved to their positions without panic and without hesitation, and they simply flowed to where they needed to be like water finding its level, Ashfur rose to his full height and spread his wings. And the dragon's roar challenged the night, and below them Lisa Grant's voice crackled over communications, directing units and calling out positions, and her tone never wavered and never showed fear of the void. Swarm came like a tide of living darkness, and their bioships descended from orbit, trailing fire and atmospheric entry. And they were not ships in any traditional sense, but living things and breathing things and hungry things that existed only to consume and convert and spread. Seraphine expected the humans to break and to flee and to beg for mercy as so many others had done before, and instead, she watched them open fire with coordinated precision, and tracers cut through the darkness. And explosions bloomed like deadly flowers, and the soldiers held their lines, the young woman. Torres was at a choke point, where the enemy pressed hardest, and her squad held the narrow gap between two buildings, and they fired in controlled bursts, and fell back when necessary, and advanced when opportunity allowed, and they moved like parts of a single organism. 3 of Torres's squad fell in the first minutes, and alien claws tore through armor and flesh, and the woman did not stop and did not hesitate, and she dragged one wounded comrade to cover and returned to the line and kept firing, and her ammunition counter dropped and dropped and dropped. Seraphine descended from the tower and moved closer to the fighting, and Ashfur followed and provided cover with gouts of dragonfire that incinerated attacking swarm creatures, and the elf needed to see this and to understand why these fragile beings fought with such intensity. Torres was alone now, and her squad was dead or evacuated. And she held the choke point by herself, and reloaded again and again, and called out positions over her radio and directed fire from other units, even as the enemy closed around her, and she had been ordered to fall back twice and had acknowledged both times and had not moved an inch. The last civilian transport lifted off behind her position, and engines roaring as it climbed toward orbit and carried refugees to safety, and Torres watched it go and nodded once and then returned her attention to the advancing swarm. Her ammunition ran out, and the weapon clicked empty, and Seraphine expected her to run then and to seek survival as any rational being would, and instead, Torres dropped the useless gun and drew a combat knife in the blade, looked pitifully small against the massive forms approaching through the smoke. She held that position for 6 more minutes, and Seraphine counted every second, and the young human fought with blade and fists and raw determination, and she killed 3 more swarm creatures before they overwhelmed her and dragged her down, and her last transmission was a simple acknowledgement that the transport had cleared the engagement zone. Seraphine reached the position too late and found only blood and spent casings and a knife driven deep into alien flesh, and Torres was gone and consumed by the enemy as they converted her biomass to fuel their endless hunger. And yet, somehow, the elf felt that the young soldier had won something here, and something more important than survival. The firebase held through the night and suffered terrible losses, and when dawn came, the swarm withdrew to regroup and to analyze and to prepare for the next assault, and Lisa Grant walked the walls and checked on her people, and her face showed the weight of command and the cost of every life lost under her watch. She found Seraphine standing where Torres had made her final stand, and the commander paused and looked at the bloodstains and the empty casings and spoke quietly. Amy Torres had been with them for 8 months and had written letters home every week and had planned to study medicine after her service and had volunteered for the rear guard because someone had to, and she had done her duty and bought the time they needed, and now her name would go on the wall with all the others. Seraphine asked why the woman had not retreated when ordered, and Lisa Grant looked at her with those tired human eyes and explained that Torres knew the transport needed more time and knew someone had to hold and chose to be that someone because that is what humans did when their people needed them. Elf returned to her observation tower as the firebase prepared for another night and another assault, and she began to write her report to the council in her hands. Hesitated over the datapad, and she had planned to recommend immediate evacuation and to advise that humanity was not worth the resources to defend. Instead, she wrote that more observation was needed and that these humans showed unusual characteristics and that she required additional time to properly document their response to the crisis. And it was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth either. Ashfear. Firebase Crimson fell on the third day, and Seraphine watched the final defense from above as Ashfear carried her through smoke-filled skies, and below them the last human soldiers fought a retreat that bought precious minutes for the final evacuations. And they moved with discipline, even as their fortress crumbled around them, and even as the void swarm poured through breached walls like a living. Floodlisa Grant was the last to leave and stood on the command platform calling coordinates and directing fire until the moment her transport lifted off, and even then, she continued, until the firebase disappeared beneath a carpet of alien biomass, and her final words were confirmation that every civilian had escaped and every soldier had extracted or died buying time for others. The survivors retreated to Iron Haven, and it was a massive underground fortress carved into the heart of a mountain range, and human engineers had spent decades building it and stocking it and preparing for a siege that might never come, and now that siege had arrived, and 10,000 souls sheltered behind meters of reinforced stone and steel. Seraphine descended into the depths with the refugees and found a city beneath the earth, and living quarters and hydroponic farms and medical facilities and armories and command centers and everything needed to sustain life for months or even years. And the humans had prepared for this and had known their surface colonies might fall and had built accordingly. She was assigned quarters near the command level in Ashfear. Barely fit in the large cargo bay they converted for him, and the dragon grumbled about confined spaces, but settled in with resigned patience, and his presence comforted the human children who came to stare at him with wide eyes and fearless curiosity. A woman found Seraphine on the second day in Iron Haven and introduced herself as Dr. Natalie Brooks, and she was a xenobiologist who studied the void swarm with clinical detachment. In her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who saw patterns where others saw only chaos. Natalie led the elf through laboratories where human scientists dissected swarm specimens and analyzed their biology and mapped their neural networks, and the doctor explained their strategy with the calm certainty of someone who had done the calculations and knew the odds and accepted them. Anyway, humanity could not defeat the swarm through superior firepower, and they lacked the numbers and the technology and the raw strength that other species possessed, and instead they waged war through attrition and made every meter of ground so costly that the enemy would exhaust their resources before achieving victory. Seraphine argued this was madness and said no species could outlast the swarm, and that 27 worlds had tried and 27 worlds had fallen. And Natalie simply smiled and responded that those other species had not been human and had not understood what it meant to refuse defeat. The doctor showed her projections and models and casualty estimates that made the elf's blood run cold, and humanity would lose millions before this ended and would sacrifice entire colonies and fleets and generations of soldiers, and yet the numbers showed it was possible, and that if they held long enough and bled the enemy enough and never broke, then mathematics favored their survival days, blurred into weeks, and Seraphine observed the patterns of life in Iron Haven, and children still attended schools and adults still worked their jobs, and soldiers still trained and drilled and prepared for the next assault, and everywhere she looked humans continued living as if normalcy was an act of defiance against the darkness above. She met Lieutenant Maya Chen in the Tactical Operations Center, and the young officer managed defensive systems and coordinated patrols and analyzed enemy movements with sharp focus, and her screen showed casualty reports and loss projections and the names of the dead scrolling past an endless list. Seraphine showed Seraphine the wall of remembrance, and it covered an entire corridor and stretched from floor to ceiling, and every surface was carved with names and thousands upon thousands of names, and each represented a human who had fallen defending their species and their future. Lieutenant explained that they fought because those names could not, and that every soldier understood their duty and knew their sacrifice might be demanded and accepted that cost, because some things mattered more than individual survival, and humanity was one of those things. Seraphine asked if Maya feared death, and the young woman considered the question and answered honestly that she did, and that any sane being feared oblivion, and yet fear did not excuse inaction, and did not justify surrender, and so she would do her duty. Despite her fear and would fight until victory or death claimed her, the Void Swarm found Iron Haven. In the 4th week, and their forces gathered above the mountain and began the long process of drilling and digging and clawing through stone to reach the fortress. Below, and seismic sensors detected their approach and tracked their progress, and humanity prepared its defense alarms. Sounded throughout the complex, and soldiers moved to defensive positions, and civilians retreated to deeper shelters, and Seraphine armed herself and moved toward the front lines with HFY following, and for the first time she would fight beside humans rather than simply observe them. Swarm broke through in Sector 7 and poured into the access tunnels like infection, spreading through veins, and human defenders met them with fire and fury, and the confined spaces became charnel houses where neither side could retreat and neither side would yield. Seraphine fought in those tunnels, and her blade sang through alien flesh, and HFY's fire turned narrow corridors into crematoriums, and around them human soldiers fought with desperate efficiency, and they covered each other and called targets and moved with coordination born of endless training. She saw Private Kelly Stone drag wounded comrades from a collapsed tunnel and make for trips through poison gas and falling debris. And the young woman's environmental suit was breached, and toxins seeped through, and still she refused extraction until everyone else was clear, and by the 4th trip she was coughing blood and her skin showed. Chemical burns medics rushed Kelly to the infirmary, and Seraphine followed and watched as doctors worked to save her and stabilize her and flush the toxins from her system, and the private would survive, but would carry scars for whatever remained of her short human life. The elf visited Kelly 3 days later and found her in recovery, and bandages covered her arms and chest, and her breath still rasped with damaged lungs, and yet she smiled when Seraphine entered and asked if everyone had made it out, and seemed pleased when told they had. Seraphine asked why Kelly had risked her life for comrades. She barely knew, and the young woman looked confused by the question and explained that they were her people, and that was reason enough. And no other explanation seemed necessary to her. The battle for Sector 7 lasted 6 days, and humanity held the line and pushed the swarm back and sealed the breach with explosives and molten metal, and bought themselves more time and more survival and more days to continue existing. Exagrant aged visibly under the strain in command, and her hair seemed grayer and her shoulders more bowed, and yet she never faltered and never showed weakness to her soldiers, and maintained the fiction that victory was inevitable if they just held on a little longer. Seraphine found herself believing that fiction and beginning to understand that perhaps it was not fiction at all, and that these humans had learned something her ancient species had forgotten, and they had discovered that belief itself could be a weapon, and that conviction could overcome impossible odds. She watched soldiers train in the lower levels and practice tactics and study enemy patterns and prepare for battles that might never come, and they did this without complaint and without despair, and they simply continued because stopping was not an option. Their minds would consider. In the mess hall, she heard them laugh and share stories and remember fallen friends and make plans for after the war, as if the war's end was certain and as if survival was guaranteed. And the elf realized this too was a weapon, and that hope kept them fighting when logic said surrender was the only rational choice. Natalie Brooks found her one evening and sat beside her, and they watched soldiers play cards and exchange jokes and maintain their humanity. In the depths of a mountain, while death circled above, and the doctor spoke quietly, she explained that humanity had evolved as persistence hunters, and that their ancestors had chased prey across continents and worn down animals stronger and faster than themselves through sheer, relentless endurance, and that this trait had carried into their species. Very soul humans did not win through strength and did not triumph through speed, and instead they won by refusing to stop and by continuing when all others had given up, and by making their enemies pay such a terrible price that victory became worthless. The Void Swarm had never faced an enemy like this, and had never encountered a species that treated extinction as just another problem to solve through sacrifice and determination and mathematics, and the doctor believed this would be their undoing. Seraphine wrote her second report to the Galactic Council and again did not recommend evacuation and instead requested additional time for observation and noted that human defensive strategies showed unexpected effectiveness and that further study was warranted the truth. She did not write was that she had stopped observing and had started participating in that. Somewhere in these dark tunnels she had. The Void Swarm deployed their harvesters on day 42, and the massive bioships descended from orbit like dark moons, and they were larger than cities and capable of draining care planets of all biological matter within weeks, and their arrival meant the enemy had committed to total annihilation of Meridian's Edge Seraphine. Watched from Ironhaven's observation dome as 3 harvesters positioned themselves above major population centers and began extending their feeding tendrils toward. The surface in each tendril was kilometers long and pulsed with terrible hunger, and where they touched ground, the earth itself seemed to wither and die. The human fleet engaged the harvesters immediately, and dozens of warships rose from hidden bases and orbital stations, and they were small against the enemy vessels and outgunned and outnumbered, but they attacked anyway with coordination that spoke of long preparation and grim determination. Met Captain Olivia Wade in the command center, and the pilot was preparing for launch, and her flight suit was worn and patched and decorated with mission tallies that should have been impossible for any human to survive. And her ship, the Defiant Star, waited in the launch bay held together by welts and hope. Olivia explained that she had flown 17 missions against the swarm, and each time her ship had taken damage that should have been fatal, and each time the mechanics had patched her back together and sent her out again. And the captain patted her ship's hull with genuine affection and swore the vessel knew they were not finished yet. The orbital battle began at dawn, and Seraphine watched from multiple view screens as human ships darted around the harvesters like insects, attacking giants, and they focused fire on the feeding tendrils and power junctions, and any weakness their sensors could identify. Losses mounted quickly, and ships vanished in bursts of fire and expanding debris clouds, and each death removed irreplaceable resources from humanity's dwindling fleet. And yet the survivors pressed their attack and adjusted their tactics and continued fighting. The Defiant Star led a squadron through a gap in the harvesters' defenses and dropped antimatter charges directly onto its organic hull, and the explosion tore a massive wound in the bioship and caused it to list and withdraw one of its feeding tendrils. And Olivia's voice crackled over communications with grim satisfaction at the damage inflicted. Seraphine recognized the pattern, and humanity was not trying to destroy the harvesters because they lacked the firepower for that. And instead, they were making the enemy pay for every meter advanced and buying time for ground forces to evacuate civilians and prepare defenses. The flagship Indomitable commanded the fleet from high orbit, and Admiral Rachel Quinn directed the battle with calm authority, and her voice never wavered as she called out targets and redirected squadrons and acknowledged losses with brief words of Anora's swarm interceptor wing caught the Indomitable during a weapon reload cycle and tore through its shields and breached the hull in 3 places, and damage reports flooded the command channel, and the ship's reactor began cascading toward critical failure. Admiral Quinn ordered all crew to evacuate and gave them 90 seconds to reach escape pods, and then sealed the command deck and locked out remote access and began plotting an intercept course with the nearest harvester. Her final transmission went out on all frequencies and reached every human ship and every ground installation in Iron Haven's command center, where Seraphine listened with growing horror and understanding. The Admiral said to tell humanity that she had bought them tomorrow, and that her crew had served with honor, and that the Indomitable would make her final run count. And then the transmission cut, and the dying flagship accelerated toward its target. The collision was visible from the surface, and a new sun bloomed in orbit as antimatter warheads and reactor cores detonated simultaneously, and the harvester's forward section simply ceased to exist, and the massive bioship began falling toward the planet, trailing fire and biological fluids. The second harvester retreated beyond the moon and reassessed, and the third continued its operations, but with greater caution, and the human fleet had been reduced to half strength, but had proven they could hurt the enemy. And that proof mattered more than ship Seraphine felt something crack in her ancient heart in 3,000 years of life. It taught her that sacrifice was sometimes necessary, but the humans approached sacrifice differently, and they did not treat it as tragic necessity, but as honored duty on the ground. The swarm adapted to the aerial setback by committing ground forces en masse. They broke through Iron Haven's outer defenses in 6 locations simultaneously and forced humanity to fight on multiple fronts. With dwindling resources, Major Sophie Grant led the counterattack at Breach Point Alpha, and she was Lisa Grant's daughter. Though Seraphine had not known this until she checked personnel files, and Sophie had inherited her mother's determination and tactical mind. The Major's battalion charged directly into the swarm's strongest penetration and planted antimatter charges while fighting at close range, and Ashfire provided aerial support in his Dragonfire carved paths through enemy ranks and allowed the humans to advance. Seraphine fought beside them, and her blade found enemy flesh again and again, and she watched these soldiers move with practiced efficiency, and they covered each other and supported each other and died for each other without hesitations. Sophie Grant directed her forces with sharp commands and never asked them to take risks. She would not take herself, and she was always at the front, and always where the fighting was thickest. And her soldiers followed her with absolute trust. The antimatter charges were planted deep in the swarm's tunnel network and would collapse half the mountain and bury thousands of enemy organisms, but the battalion had to reach minimum safe distance before detonation, and that distance was measured in kilometers through hostile territory. They fought their way back and left rearguards at every junction to slow pursuit, and each rearguard knew they were unlikely to survive, but held their positions anyway and bought seconds and minutes for their comrades. Sophie's voice came over the radio comm despite the chaos, and she reported charges armed and detonation. Countdown initiated and ordered all units to clear the blast zone, and Seraphine realized with cold dread that the Major was not with the retreating forces. The elf pushed forward through the withdrawing soldiers and found Sophie at the final rearguard position with 5 others, and they held a narrow bottleneck against dozens of swarm warriors, and their ammunition was nearly depleted. Seraphine called for Sophie to retreat, and the Major glanced back and smiled and shook her head and explained that someone had to make sure the charges detonated properly, and that someone had to guarantee the timing was perfect, and she had volunteered for that duty. The detonation timer read 6 minutes, and Sophie ordered her squad to fall back and said we would follow in 4 minutes, and her soldiers hesitated but obeyed, because disobeying a direct order was not something they could do. Seraphine refused to leave and took position beside the Major, and Ashfire landed at the bottleneck and filled it with his bulk and his fire, and together they held while the seconds counted down. Sophie spoke quietly while she fought and mentioned that her mother had taught her that leadership meant being willing to pay any price you asked of others, and that she had asked her battalion to risk everything, and so she would do the same at 2 minutes. The squad sergeant returned against orders and took position beside them, and at 90 seconds 3 more soldiers appeared and refused to abandon their commander, and Sophie tried to order them away, but her voice broke with emotion. The timer hit 60 seconds, and Sophie triggered the remote detonation, and the world turned white, and the mountains shook, and reality fractured into thunder and falling stones. Seraphine came to consciousness, buried under rubble, and Ashfire's bulk had shielded her from the worst, and the dragon was wounded but alive, and around them was only destruction and silence. She dug for 3 days, and Ashfire used his strength to move massive stones, and they found 5 bodies in the ruins and brought them out with honor and laid them in a raw. Sophie Grant was not among them, and her body was never recovered, and the mountain had claimed her and the swarm warriors she had died stopping. Lisa Grant received the news in the command center, and Seraphine delivered it personally, because that seemed important, and the commander closed her eyes and breathed once, and her hands trembled before she steadied them. The older woman asked if Sophie had completed her mission, and Seraphine confirmed the charges had detonated perfectly, and half the enemy tunnel network was gone, and thousands of swarm organisms were buried, and the breach was sealed. Lisa nodded and said her daughter had done her duty, and now she would do hers, and she returned to her command post, and her back was straight, and her voice was steady, and only her hands betrayed her griefs. Her fun visited the wall of remembrance that night, and found Sophie's name already carved there, and beneath it someone had written that she gave tomorrow too. Save today, and the elf traced the letters with her fingers and wept for the first time in centuries. She understood now what she was witnessing, and it was not simply warfare and not merely strategy, and these humans had turned sacrifice into sacrament, and made duty into something holy. The reinforcements arrived on day 68, and they came not as an army, but as a migration, and every human colony in the sector sent what they could spare in ships. Appeared in orbit by the hundreds, and each carried soldiers and weapons, and supplies, and Hopeseraphin watched the fleet assemble from Iron Haven's observation dome, and the vessels were of every class and age, and some were military warships, while others were converted civilian transports, and a few were little more than armed freighters, but all came bearing the same determination. What shocked her most were the civilian volunteers, and thousands of them arrived demanding to fight, and they were farmers and teachers and engineers and merchants, and they had left their homes and their safety to travel to a war zone because Meridian's Edge needed defenders. Lisa Grant coordinated the integration of new forces in her command. Staff worked around the clock to organize the chaos and assign positions and distribute equipment, and somehow they transformed a mob into a functional military force. Within days, a general arrived with the fleet, and Victoria Cross was her name, and she commanded all human forces in the sector, and her reputation preceded her, and soldiers spoke of her with reverence and fear and respect. Seraphine met General Cross in the war room, and the woman was tall and lean, and her eyes held the weight of countless battles, and she assessed the elf with a single glance that seemed to see through flesh and bone, to measure what lay beneath. Victoria explained that humanity's strategic command had analyzed the situation and concluded that Moravian's Edge would be where they made their stand, and where they would prove to the galaxy that humans did not break, and this world would either be their victory or their monument. The swarm's core fleet was en route and would arrive within days, and they brought their Nexus mind, and that terrible intelligence had consumed 100 worlds and commanded millions of swarm organisms, and had never known defeat. Humanity's response to the swarm's ultimatum arrived via every broadcast frequency, and General Victoria Cross delivered it personally, and her voice carried across star systems. She said that humanity did not kneel and did not break, and that the swarm could come and learn why every species that had tried to extinguish human fire had been burned by it, and she invited them to test their hunger against human resolve. The speech was brief and brutal and honest, and it made no threats beyond the promise of resistance. And Seraphine realized that was enough, and that sometimes the simple refusal to surrender was the most powerful weapon. Preparations intensified, and soldiers drilled endlessly, and engineers reinforced defenses, and scientists analyzed enemy patterns, searching for any weakness, and the entire colony became a weapon pointed at the approaching darkness. Seraphine trained with human special forces and learned their tactics and their methods, and she was ancient and skilled, and yet they taught her new ways of fighting and new ways of thinking about warfare. She met Sergeant Nina Flores in the combat simulator, and the woman was compact and dangerous and moved with economy that spoke of thousands of hours of training, and her specialty was deep infiltration and sabotage. Nina explained their mission, and a team of 12 would infiltrate a harvester and plant an experimental quantum weapon at its core. And the weapon was untested and might not work, and even if it did, the team would likely not survive the recent detonations. Af and I asked why Nina volunteered for what seemed a suicide mission, and the sergeant shrugged and said someone had to, and she had the skills and the experience, and if she did not go, then someone else would have to, and she would not ask others to take risks she would not take. Nexus Mind arrived on day 73, and its bioship dwarfed even the harvesters, and it was a living moon and pulsed with terrible intelligence, and around it swarmed thousands of smaller vessels, and the entire swarm fleet gathered in orbit. The Nexus offered terms and broadcast them on all frequencies, and promised that humanity could serve rather than die, and could be integrated into the swarm collective, and would find peace in surrendering individual will to the greater. Purpose General Cross answered within minutes, and her response was a single word transmitted across all channels, and that word was no, and then the human fleet opened fire. The Battle of Meridian's Edge began at dawn and would last 3 days and reshape the sector's understanding of warfare and of humanity and of what it meant to refuse defeat human. Ships attacked in coordinated waves and struck at predetermined targets and died in predetermined patterns, and every loss was planned and every sacrifice calculated to achieve maximum effects. Scifi flew with HFY among the orbital chaos, and they supported attack runs and rescued damaged ships and fought. Swarm interceptors and the dragon's ancient strength combined with elvish precision made them formidable. She watched human tactics evolve in real time, and they adapted to swarm responses within minutes and turned every enemy's success into a trap and every retreat into an ambush. The Nexus mind was learning too, and it adjusted strategies and deployed new formations, and the battle became a contest of adaptation and evolution compressed into Arza on the ground. Nina Flores and her team launched their infiltration mission, and their stealth shuttle slipped through the orbital battle and approached the Nexus Mine's bioship and vanished into its organic hull like a parasite entering. A host communications were spotty, but Nina's reports came through periodically, and the team fought through internal defenses and navigated alien corridors and pushed deeper toward the core. They lost 3 soldiers in the first hour and 2 more. 2 biological defenses that dissolved their suits in flesh, and the remaining 7 continued because turning back was never an option. Nina's voice grew strained as they penetrated deeper, and the Nexus mind became aware of their presence and sent internal defenses to stop them, and the team fought running battles through passages that tried to close around them. At the core they found what human scientists had theorized, and the Nexus mind's central consciousness, and a vast biological computer that processed information from thousands of swarm nodes and directed the entire invasion. Quantum weapon was planted and armed, and Nina set the timer for 5 minutes and ordered her team to evacuate, but the defenses had sealed the paths behind them. An escape was impossible. 4 soldiers died holding the perimeter, and 2 more fell protecting the weapon. And Nina stood alone at the end, and her last transmission was a countdown and a simple statement that she had done what she came to do. The quantum weapon detonated, and reality fractured at the quantum level, and the Nexus mind died screaming across psychic wavelengths, and every swarm organism connected to it felt that death and recoiled in horror. Effin heard the scream even from orbit, and HFY roared in pain, and across the battlefield swarm forces faltered and lost coordination and became individuals rather than parts of a collective. The human fleet pressed their advantage and destroyed harvesters and command ships, and the remains of the core fleet, and the swarm began retreating and abandoning Meridian's Edge rather than continue paying the terrible price humanity demanded on the ground. Scifi fought beside soldiers who sensed victory approaching, and they pushed harder and advanced faster and showed no mercy to an enemy that had shown none. She was pinned by a swarm warrior, and its claws reached for her throat, and 3,000 years of life seemed about to end in a tunnel beneath an alien world. Private Jordan Hayes threw herself between them and took the killing blow, and the claws tore through her armor and her body, and she fell without a sound. Scifi killed the warrior and caught Jordan as she collapsed, and the young woman's eyes were wide, and her breath came in gasps, and blood pooled beneath them. Jordan smiled, and her lips formed words, and Scifi leaned close to hear, and the private whispered that it was worth it, and that saving an ally was worth dying for. And then her eyes closed, and she was Gonishvir, landed beside them, and the dragon's roar carried grief and rage, and for the first time in the ancient beast's long life, the sound held sorrow for a being not of his own kind. Scifi held Jordan's body, and wept and understood finally and completely what she had been witnessing, and these humans did not fight for territory, did not war for resources, and they battled for each other and for the belief that protecting their own was worth any price. The swarm retreated fully on day 76, and their remaining ships fled the system and left. Meridian's Edge, scarred but unconquered in humanity, has had won not through strength but through refusal and through sacrifice and through the simple, stubborn determination to never stop fighting. Victory celebrations were muted, and soldiers mourned their dead, even as they secured the battlefield, and Lisa Grant walked among her people and thanked them, and honored them, and promised their sacrifice would be remembered. General Victoria Cross stood on the surface and watched the last swarm ships vanish into hyperspace, and she spoke quietly to those around her. She said that humanity had proven something today and had shown the galaxy that they would not be victims and would not be prey, and that any species that came for them would pay in blood and tears, and that price would never stop. Rising Seraphin filed her final report to the Galactic Council, and this time she wrote the complete truth and explained what she had witnessed and what she had learned. She wrote that humanity's strength was not technology and not tactics. The swarm never returned to Meridian's Edge, and they had learned what every predator eventually learns when they encounter prey that fights back hard enough, and sometimes the cost of hunting exceeds the value of the kill, and humanity had made themselves too expensive to consume. Seraphine stood among ruins that had once been Phi-based crimson and watched human workers clear debris and begin rebuilding, and they sang while they worked, and the songs were about loss and hope in the future. They would create from ashes. 60% of the defenders were dead, and every city was rubble, and the landscape was scarred by weapons that had torn through earth and stone and living flesh, and yet the survivors built rather than mourned, and created rather than grieved. Lisa Grant had found her there on the third day after the battle, and a commander carried a young tree in a container and walked to the crater where her daughter Sophie had made her last stand, and knelt in the ashy dug with her hands, and Seraphine knelt beside her and helped, and together they planted the tree in soil mixed with blood and debris, and Lisa poured water from a canteen and spoke quietly. Sophie had loved these trees and had written about them in her letters, and had said they reminded her that life found ways to continue and to grow and to reach toward light even in darkness, and now this tree would grow where she had fallen and would be her monument. Lisa stood and brushed dirt from her hands and looked at the horizon where reconstruction crews worked and refugees returned to ruined homes and children played in the wreckage, and she smiled with tired satisfaction. The commander said that they had won something here and had proven something important, and the galaxy would remember Meridian's Edge and would know that humanity could not be broken, and she seemed content with that. Legacy Seraphin returned to Iron Haven and began writing her final report, and this time she included everything and held nothing back, and wrote with honesty that would have shocked her younger self. She described Amy Torres holding a choke point alone and buying time with her life, and she wrote about Kelly Stone dragging wounded through poison gas and refusing to leave anyone behind. She detailed Sophie Grant's sacrifice in the mountain she had collapsed, and the thousands of enemy she had buried, and she honored Nina Flores, who had penetrated a Nexus mind and killed it with her last breath. She wrote about Jordan Hayes throwing herself between danger and an ally, and dying with a smile because she believed some things were worth dying for most. Importantly, she wrote about what these sacrifices meant and what they revealed about humanity, and why every other species should pay attention. Humans fought as if they had already won, because in their minds the outcome was certain, and defeat was simply not something they would accept, and this belief became reality through sheer force of will. They protected each other with intensity that seemed irrational, until you understood that humans defined themselves through their connections, and that saving a fellow human, saving part of themselves. They endured suffering that would break other species because they had evolved as persistence hunters and as survivors, and their entire history was a story of refusing to stop and refusing to die. And refusing to accept limits. The Galactic Council received her report and debated for 3 cycles and called witnesses and consulted experts, and eventually reached consensus, and the Twilight Dominion would offer humanity a formal treaty of alliance. It was the first time in 3,000 years that Seraphine's people had declared another species their equal, and the first time they had sought alliance rather than simply granting protection or demanding tribute.
Council,
asked Seraphine why she recommended this, and she had appeared before them in person, and stood in chambers where she had stood countless times before, and spoke with conviction that surprised even herself. She said that humanity had taught her what resolve meant, and what it looked like when a species refused to accept defeat regardless of the odds or the cost. She explained that humans carried something worth dying for, and that belief made them the most dangerous species in the galaxy, because there was no limit to what they would sacrifice, and no price they would not pay. Any species that went to war with humanity would win battles, but would lose wars, because humans would never stop and would never surrender and would simply continue fighting until their enemy broke or both sides were extinct. The council accepted her recommendation and began drafting treaty terms, and Seraphine returned to Moravian's Edge rather than remaining on her homeworld, and she had discovered something there. That she wanted to protect. The reconstruction continued and took months and then years, and slowly the scars faded, and new cities rose, and children who had hidden in shelters grew up in a world that was being reborn. Seraphine walked among humans and learned their ways and understood their culture, and somewhere in that process, she stopped thinking of them as primitives and started thinking of them as friends. She visited the Wall of Remembrance often, and it had grown to cover several buildings and stretched across restored plazas, and every name was carved with care, and every sacrifice was honored. One day she brought her own tools and added a name in Elvish script, and Jordan Hayes, who had saved her life, now had her name written in a language that would last millennia, and beneath it, Seraphine carved words in human language. She wrote that Jordan had taught her honor and had shown her what it meant to value another's life above your own, and that this lesson was worth more than all the wisdom of Seraphine's 3,000-year Sushvir recovered fully from his wounds and bore new scars across his scales. And the dragon seemed changed by what he had witnessed, and he spent hours watching human children play and seemed fascinated by their resilience. The ancient beast told Seraphine, in the wordless way dragons communicated, that he had seen many species rise and fall, but had never seen one that fought with such heart and such refusal to accept defeat. Humans came to visit Ashvir and brought him offerings of food and drew pictures of him and told him stories, and the dragon accepted their attention with patience that surprised Seraphine. One child asked if Ashvir was afraid during the battle, and the dragon rumbled thoughtfully, and the elf translated his response. She said that yes, he had been afraid because fear was natural and sensible when facing death, but that fear did not mean surrender and did not excuse inaction, and the humans had taught him this. Child nodded with understanding beyond her years and said that her father had taught her the same thing before he died holding the wall at Sector 7, and that she would remember his lesson. Always treaties were signed and alliances were formalized, and the Twilight Dominion sent ambassadors and trade delegations and military liaisons, and the relationship between ancient elves and young humans began in earnest. Other species watched and calculated and reconsidered their positions regarding humanity, and word spread through the galaxy about what had happened at Meridian's Edge. The story grew in the telling and became legend, and some details were embellished and others were forgotten, but the core truth remained, and humanity had faced extinction and had refused to accept it. Seraphine received offers to return home and take up positions of honor and prestige, and she declined them all and chose to remain on Meridian's Edge as the Dominion's permanent ambassador. She wanted to continue learning and continue understanding and continue witnessing. What happened when a species decided that some things were worth any price? Lisa Grant was promoted to general and given command of the sector's defenses, and her first act was to expand the Wall of Remembrance and ensure that every human who had fallen would be honored properly. She invited Seraphine to the dedication ceremony, and the elf stood among thousands of humans and listened to names being read and watched families grieve and witnessed a species that refused to forget its dead. Victoria Cross gave the main address and spoke about sacrifice and duty and the price of survival, and she said that those who had fallen had bought humanity's future with their lives, and that debt could never be fully repaid, but they would try. And they would honor the dead through how they lived and through building a civilization worth dying for, and through teaching the next generation what their predecessors had taught them Seraphini. Added her own words and spoke in human language that she had learned and thanked those who had fallen for teaching her what courage meant and what resolve looked like when faced with impossible odds. She said that her people had thought themselves wise and ancient and superior, but that humanity had shown them there was still much to learn, and that sometimes the youngest species carried the oldest truths. Years passed and Meridian's Edge thrived in new generations. Grew up hearing stories of the battle and learning lessons their parents had paid for in blood. The Void Swarm never returned, but humanity prepared anyway and built defenses and trained soldiers and maintained readiness because they had learned that peace was temporary and that vigilance was eternal. Seraphin remained and watched it all and recorded it all and tried to capture in words what she had witnessed and what it meant for the galaxy. She wrote that humanity marched to war with fire in their hearts and hope in their hands and carried belief that some things were worth dying for. She wrote that this made them dangerous. It made them allies worth having and made them a species that would reshape the galaxy simply by refusing to accept limits.